members. So know that that is the title that I gave Renee, but then of course I changed it to describe my entire talk in the title. So first I want to thank Joe and Liz for inviting me to talk with you today. What I'm going to do is try to convince you, because I've been convincing myself, to think about stress as an intervention target, and not only as a target to change, but also think about how if you change stress, you could also not decrease stress, but also change an outcome. So it could be a target for health behaviors. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the generous funding from National Institute on Aging. I'm very excited about all these projects, but I'll be talking mainly today about some new work that's been made available to us because of the Science of Behavior, the SOBC Science of Behavior Change Research Network. Exciting network, just getting off the ground. See my new colleagues here, and I'm excited to, after just hearing Eric's talk, I can't wait to talk more about what he's doing and what we're trying to do as well. The Midlife in the United States study and the National Study of Daily Experiences has been part of my professional life for over 20 years. Can't help but talk a little bit about that, as well as the project that got me into thinking about interventions, which is the Work, Family, and Health Network. So I want to get going by laying some foundation about what we mean, what I mean by stress. It's a commonly used construct, a term. It means a bunch of things from an actual event to some feeling. And I'll just put a couple definitions up, and hopefully this will help with some thinking down the line of actually how we measure this construct. So engineers describe stress as a force exerted on a body that strains or deforms its shape. Human definition is a little bit similar, refers to pressure that life exerts on us and the way this pressure makes us feel. And I like these two definitions because they decompose stress into at least two main dimensions that I think are really important to think about. One is the stressor or the events or the triggers that would lead to a response. And so in my work, I've always tried to deconstruct or decompose these two components of the stress process into a stressor or exposure to the events, as well as how we respond to these events, or what I call reactivity. Considering stress is important in terms of trying to understand its effect on health and well-being. Many studies, some of mine, but certainly many others, have shown that large, prolonged, and frequent responses to stress can influence health and well-being. What I'm going to propose today is that one potential pathway to how stress affects health is through health behaviors. Specifically, I'm interested in how stress disrupts decisions to engage in physical activity, as well as disrupts our sleep. And probably most importantly about the role of stress is that its role in these health behaviors is one that is very proximal to the behavior. So we experience stress, we make decisions about the behaviors we're going to do, or the behaviors we're going to try to enact, close in time to when stress happens. However, existing tools to assess stress do not well capture this dynamic process of both looking at stress and how stress is associated with health behaviors. Most tools provide broad, relatively static, and what I would call person-level indicators of stress. This is unfortunate because I think they miss the important temporal response and components of stress processes that are critical in shaping health behaviors and behavior decisions to enact these health behaviors. So what I'm trying to promote, what I'm trying to develop, is to develop efficient, ecologically valid, and within-person approaches to measuring as well as intervening on deleterious effects of everyday stress on engaged in work activities. That is our charge for the next 5 years. Let's see if we get there. In thinking about stress, I and others have developed what I would call a daily stress paradigm. This paradigm basically has two main features. One is the content of stress. And so I typically focus on everyday stressors or minor stressors, what Lazarus called hassles. These are challenges and frustrations of everyday life, like having an argument or having a computer breakdown. The other important component is the assessment of these things. And this assessment occurs intensively over time and repeatedly over time. So the idea is to capture stressors when they happen again, 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 and again, to see sort of how they naturally unfold over time. You capture the stressors, but you can also capture people's responses to the stressors this way. This has certain advantages. One, it allows us to capture naturally occurring stressors. Things that are sort of ecologically valid that actually occur in our natural life. They minimize memory bias, so instead of asking people about stressors over a long period of time, I typically ask them over the past 24 hours, even shorter periods of time. You can evaluate the daily exposures, how often these things happen. And then, for me, most importantly, what's been most useful and productive is being able to calculate what I call stressor reactivity, or within-person slopes. So when I talk about stress, I'm typically thinking about stressor reactivity, which I define as a within-person slope between experiencing a stressor and what is your emotional response, behavioral response, or biological response. So here is an emotional response. So these are two people. These two people on a stressor-free day, their negative affect is typically the same. This is kind of what we really do find in more data. And then on stressor days, some people are called high reactors. These are like Velcro people. On days they experience a stressor, they have high levels of negative affect. Other people are more like Teflon people. They experience a stressor and it sort of slides off and they don't have negative affect at the end of the day. So we've shown that the stress reactivity can play an important role in health and well-being. So people in this audience have shown with me how if you have high stressor reactivity, you increase your likelihood of depression, chronic health conditions, increased risk of mortality, increases in inflammation, decreases in heart rate variability, as well as decreases in financial net worth. And I cannot wait to talk to the decision-making folks about why this might be. And I was very excited to hear Eric's preliminary findings. Is we show in the Almeida study how childhood disadvantage is associated with chronic health conditions, but we show that this can be mediated by daily stressor reactivity. So once you account for daily stressor reactivity, the effect of childhood disadvantage disappears. So for the past 20 years, I've tried to show and find, and yes, experiencing daily stressors is unhealthy. And just like Eric, I feel like the next phase of my career should be, well, what can we do about it? And so I'm going to present to you two different ways that I've been thinking about intervening on the stress process. One way is to target the context. So stressors don't occur in a vacuum, they occur in multiple social contexts. So we can think about changing the neighborhood, think about changing family life, think about changing workplaces to make them sort of less stressful. The other way to think about it is actually target the stressor response in and of itself. We know when it's happening, we know when this response is happening. Can we deliver an intervention to reduce that response? So let me give you an example of targeting the context. These are some findings based on the Work Family Health Research Network, which is a very large workplace intervention where we randomly assigned work groups to different conditions. And one of these conditions was our workplace initiative that tried to change workplace culture and workplace practices called STAR, Support, Transform, Achieve Results. So people who were work groups that were assigned to this condition, they participated in sessions that basically in the end tried to increase worker support for each other, as well as strategies to increase what we call temporal flexibility, to figure out ways to use work to give you more time with your family, more access to your family. The other arm of the intervention was to educate supervisors to be more supportive of family needs of their workers. We did this intervention, the whole study was on over 3,000 workers, half from information technology workplace, as well as half from assisted care workplaces. Around 1,500 of the workers were assigned to one of these interventions. Other was just usual practice. So this is a massive study. There are many, many parts of it. So this is just a figure that first of all describes the timeline where we implemented the intervention after a baseline period and had 3 follow-ups. And then we have multiple sources of information. So all those all those circles represents one source of information we got from people at baseline and then after. And what I'm going to do, my big part is just 2 little circles actually. We'll talk about one little circle, which is we did daily surveys, daily diary surveys to get at stressor exposures and responses pre and post the intervention. And so this is the idea, is that you participate in the intervention, you might reduce your exposure to daily stressors, but it might buffer the reactivity of daily stressors. And just to give you the big results, we found no effects on exposure at all. So the intervention did not decrease the number of stressors that you had, but it did seem to show reduced reactivity to these stressors. So moving on now to a more focused way to intervene on the stress process. Rather than looking at trying to change the context, can we actually change the stressor response? In order to do that, I had to completely rethink how I assess reactivity. And so I have become honest with myself that perhaps I really wasn't studying reactivity at all. I was studying more of the dispositional quality of how people respond to stressors. And so what we're doing now is not only looking at specific aspects of stress processes, but really focusing on the dynamics of stressors. So not just whether people experience stressors, but how often they happen and how long the stressors last. And for me, more importantly, and probably more excitingly, is specific temporal characteristics of a stress response, including how high people react, how long it takes them to recover, and then the extent to which these responses pile up over time. And so, what we're trying to do in our work now is to capture different types of stress responses. It's the first goal. One is to maybe think about an adaptive response where you have a reaction that you come down more quickly. A heightened reaction where the reaction is very high. A long reaction where you don't recover quickly. And then this idea of pileup, where you have these multiple stressors. Okay. So I'll quickly go through what we're doing with this right now is that my colleagues and I, Marty Slowinski and Josh Smythe, together we've been doing this type of work for long enough that we required many data sets that we could test these ideas in. So we have 10 different data sets where we're first trying to see if we can capture these temporal components of stressor responses, reactivity, recovery, and pileup. Once we identify them, we're going to try to replicate them and make sure that we actually capture them. And then hopefully design an instrument that is both sensitive as well as not burdensome that you can employ in many different research situations. So our promissory note for SOBC is to provide a platform with a wide range of tools for interventions where you can use a research tool that will assess exposure to daily stressors, but also the temporal components of the responses. This is my last slide, I promise. What we hope to provide in the end, so maybe in a couple of years I can come back and actually show how we do, is help us to think about stress response targets with an ecological focus. What we want to do is what Barker promoted more than half a decade ago now, is study naturally occurring behavior of free-ranging humans. By capturing everyday stress processes and health behaviors as they unfold naturally in real-time context. And then the last thing I want to mention is that when we think about interventions, it's important to think about who, but probably even more important, we're thinking about when. And when we think about health behaviors and when people engage in health behaviors, these decisions are contingent upon not only features of the person, but the immediate psychosocial environment that the person is engaged in right now. So optimal interventions will not only target specific people who are at risk, but also when they're at risk. Thank you.